Well, good morning to the few people that are here today. My name is Natasha Kitano. I am one of the language and learning educators with the grad team, and I'm coordinating the Foundations of Supervision module this semester, in semester 2. So today, this week, we've had the pleasure of coordinating this week, moderating this week is Professor Jean Moyle, and welcome you here this morning, Jean.
Thanks.
So we've decided to change things up a little bit this time, and usually we'd just do a little chat, Jean and I, and we would record that, but we thought we would invite people into the discussion. So we're doing a little Q&A. It is being recorded, and we will send that out to those who aren't able to be here. So Jean is going to start with a little recap of the week, which has been the role of the supervisor. So it's been an interesting topic. And as throughout, there's a little chat function. So I'll invite all of you to put any questions that you have for Jean, or any comments or feedback that you have about the content of the week, and then we can discuss that as we go. So I'll hand over to you, Jean, please, if you could just give a little recap.
No worries. Thanks, Sasha. And firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagras, the First Nations owners of the lands on which we're all gathering or zooming in today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to anybody online today. So welcome. Week 2, role of the supervisor. I always really appreciate being involved in this, because I think as I mentioned in one of my messages in the discussion forum, people have a variation of experiences, with this, and it's always great to learn different approaches and different perspectives. So for the week, I might get Tasha, if you could pull up the kind of the landing page. So just to recap for people are invited, to either there was an article or effectively a video that you were invited to watch, and then kind of consider what your responses might be, or what your take was on those scenarios. Not surprisingly, most people chose the supervisor team dilemma. I think that's always an interesting one to kind of revisit and so starkly see, where sometimes things can really kind of go wrong for everyone involved. So really thinking about becoming a supervisor and what this is focused on this week is that ability to really think about, and again, too, it came through in the discussion around we've all gone through those experiences, and we're all on different spectrums in terms of some people just more recently finishing their HDR studies and becoming supervisors versus people that have been supervisors for a while. But often that first experience that we have, it plays such a significant, so effectively it focuses on really how, if we've had a negative experience, and maybe our learnings from what we wouldn't do, as well as what we might have liked to have experienced from a supervisory perspective. So, for me, in looking at the discussion forum, what I've mentioned in a couple of my posts has been that aspect of how do you think about it from a team perspective, and recognizing that students come to their PhDs in different ways. So we saw that where some people in certain discipline areas recruit, students to projects, versus others where students are searching out supervisors. And it's really important in terms of those initial phases to think about how we're looking at this from a supervisory team perspective, and effectively how are we establishing expectations for all of the people within that team, both, principal or associate supervisors. For me, regardless of roles and responsibilities, we're supervisors, and we share that responsibility, again, in varying perspectives, and bring different expertise to that, but also, understanding the students' perspective of what their expectations are. And certainly I know that, and again, as people have mentioned in their discussion posts, different students will operate in different ways, and that certainly I know I've seen has played out a lot in terms of dealing with different cultural backgrounds and understanding the differences in terms of how people view the role of the supervisor, and people in positions of hierarchy, or what they, that potential power differential. So, knowing that, coming together and really thinking about how are we going to operate as a team? What are those expectations of communication? As I mentioned, for me, I'm always, regardless of who, whether that's internal or external supervisors, any correspondence that I have, with the student about supervision, everyone's copied in to just keep people on the same page. Also, too, knowing that there are times at which we might, and with different students, we might actually, take the lead at different points in time in terms of different parts of the student's candidature. So there might be, one supervisor that has a clear expertise in a particular area that's really relevant to help lead that student. And in some cases do have different supervision sessions, not always at the same time, but that ability to make sure that we're connecting behind the scenes to share that information as well as with the student. So I think some of the key things in terms of the dilemma itself were that sense of that came through from people's responses, the lack of communication with just between each other, and that ability to really putting the onus kind of on the student, in that situation to solve that kind of, will make that bridge between the supervisors. And really, that's an unfair position to put the student in. So while I completely agree around that ability, to how are we supporting and enabling the student to be autonomous and to make decisions for themselves, recognizing that power differential and that understanding of, well, actually, again, early in the phase, we really do need to provide a guiding, supportive approach to students in supervision, and that then shifts potentially over time, but that ability to make sure that we're all on the same page. And I think the poll in terms of how people responded, for me, it's always that opportunity to, how do we talk and get together to have a discussion about how do we actually sort this out? Because at the end of the day, the person that we're there to support is actually the student and their studies. So if something isn't working, well, what's my responsibility, what's the other supervisor's responsibility, and also what's the student's responsibility as well in that. And the ability to check in about that over time, that we know that candidatures change depending upon the stage of where they're at. And so different types of support or structures or processes might be needed in terms of supervisory meetings or communication, or again, who kind of takes the lead in that. So that ability to kind of check in, and also for me, ask the student, are you getting what you need? So not leaving it up to the annual progress report to suddenly get feedback from the student saying they're not really getting what they need, but that ability, again, thinking about it from a team perspective, are they getting what they need out of the supervisory team? And also too, are we getting what we need, out of the student too, in terms of the support for them to be able to meet, the deadlines and the milestones in their candidature. And certainly, that ability to recognise and learn from other supervisors. So one of the things that again came out within the discussion was that ability to, where people have had experiences co-supervising with people either across different schools within the same faculty, different faculties, completely different disciplines. And I've been very grateful to have had that opportunity to do that quite a lot for a number of HDR students. And that's been really a really great learning experience to understand the different types of research approaches or methodologies from other areas, and how we might view the same kind of research questions or what we're trying to get at from completely different perspectives. Then that ability to look at, well, on the basis of where the student is situated, what type of discipline the student's in, and where they want to establish themselves as moving towards an expert in that area, what's going to be most beneficial in terms of the way in which we actually approach that for the student, and how do we actually balance that out in terms of bringing from potentially both areas. And again, I think as people mentioned, you're not having that argument, well, hopefully it's not an argument or debate in front of the student. It's that ability to go, well, if we, often I'll talk to other supervisors to go, oh, with this particular thing, we know the student is struggling with, what would you do normally within your discipline area in terms of the approach from a methodology perspective or a research design perspective, and what would we do? And where can we draw from potentially both? Or is there one way that actually is going to be more beneficial for the type of research that the student's doing, regardless of whether that's not my discipline area or approach? So I think that that particular area too, in thinking not just about the people and the team dynamics, but it's also the different approaches, and ensuring that the working relationship that's set up between everybody in the supervisory team, including the student, where people feel they have that ability to ask questions or debate particular topics or perspectives, to find the best way forward, and the best way forward for the student, and that ability to invite the student's perspective in that, which again I've observed shifts, over time, where they get more experience or they bring their professional experience or academic experience to that. So I think there have been some really, really great responses, and that ability to kind of share ideas. And for the most part, people were all, not surprisingly, on the same page that, hey, that kind of scenario, that kind of dilemma isn't the most helpful one to be in. And how do you ensure that you're managing that right from the start? So those would be kind of probably the primary takeaways, Tasha, I think, in terms of this week and what's kind of come out of the discussion.
Yeah, fantastic. You've done a great job there, Jean, of the recap. I have some things in my brain that I'd like to put out there, but I'll just open it to the people that are here today. If you do feel comfortable putting on your video, I think that's nice for us to be able to see your faces. So for the people who are in attendance, would you like to ask any questions to Jean or have any comments on what Jean has just mentioned, or feedback from the course itself?
I have a question.
Hi there, Joe.
Hi, Jean. Hi, Natasha. Thanks, and I'm really enjoying the course so far. I'm finding it really useful and very informative. And I'm looking to take on my first principal supervision starting in a couple of weeks' time. So I've been associate on several masters and doctorates already. I just want to ask about, is there any kind of any research or knowledge that's been done around the benefits of having more than two supervisors? Because several of the projects I've been associated with in the past that I've been associate supervisor on, I was kind of the third, or in one case, actually the fourth internal supervisor. Is there a trend that suggests that there are better outcomes from when there is a maximum of two supervisors, or is it actually beneficial for the candidate to have more than two?
Great question, Joe. I personally don't know of research. That would be interesting actually to find out, in terms of if that's been looked at in terms of impact. I mean, I've seen probably where there has been, 3 or, as you said, sometimes 4, depending upon the study and the expertise that it brings, that's actually contributed to a robustness of actually input, but it's how that input and how that supervision is actually managed, so it doesn't become confusing for the student or cross purposes in terms of what's added in. So I can only talk from the experience of working on ones where it has been only 2 people versus ones that's been broader, and really it's just shifted on the basis of what the research topic was actually about. But we were very clear about who played what role at what time, and how do we engage. So sometimes the student would engage with one of the supervisors, particularly if they're an external one, separately to the rest of the supervisory group, because it was very specific expertise, but we'd kind of loop back in and make sure that we were kind of getting updates on where that was at. So it wasn't like trying to involve 4 people and everything, all the time. So yes, I'm not sure, Tasha, I'm not sure if you know of any research explicitly on the number of supervisors.
It's interesting, Joe. I'm doing research on supervision myself, and I attended a reading group the other evening. And the article that we read, I've just put it in the chat, is about co-supervision. So go and have a look at that article. It's quite interesting. And Jean and I were having a chat earlier. In QUT, it's a requirement to have more than one supervisor, but it's not across the board. And I think one of the people who was in attendance at this reading group was telling us that at her university, and I'll have to go back and see what university that was. In fact, the co-supervisor has to be from another discipline, is the way that they're taking on the co-supervisor role, which I think is really interesting. And Jean and I were having a little chat beforehand about the value of transdisciplinarity for students and for supervisors actually. And so yeah, I bet there is a lot other research, but I'm not sure everybody here, your backgrounds, and if you did your PhD at QUT or where you did your university and what the requirements were. But I think it is probably a growing trend. Jean, would you suggest?
Yeah, but look, I think, I mean, you know, we know in terms of even if we think about HDR panels and the requirements for the panel makeup, you know, is around the supervisory team and broader people that sit outside of that, and also too that can sit outside of the actual faculty as well. So I think it is, again, it just depends upon the area and the discipline area as well, because things can be very, very specific to one area. But certainly when we're thinking about, you know, out and working, you know, in the real world, so to speak, you're working across, and in some disciplines are very used to working in a transdisciplinary way. It's just inherent in terms of that particular area. So it wouldn't be surprising in terms of that shift around that ability to ensure that there is kind of a different representation. But for me too, it needs to be really relevant to the expertise that's required for the research for the student. So and that's what I think came up in terms of, well, how do you go about finding people? And I think we had a couple of suggestions, whether they were HDR coordinators or research trainers, you know, people in a different area that you can reach out to say, look, who do you know that might actually have some expertise in this that you know you don't necessarily know within your own network. But I think I've found that it's been a really helpful approach to have, again, as long as everyone's understanding how they work together in terms of adding their different perspectives and disciplinary expertise into the process.
Yeah, one of the things that we discussed last night about this article was, and I think you picked up on it as well, Jean, about so yes, there's a power imbalance between the HDR student and the supervisor, but sometimes there's also that power imbalance between the novice novice supervisor, the co-supervisor, and the principal supervisor as well. And it's something that needs to be maybe also addressed in a private way, not in front of the student as well.
Yeah, look, definitely. And I think that's the thing too, like certainly having been a mentoring supervisor and, you know, for people that are building up that experience, you know, that's also remembering, you know, that playing that role is about supporting that other supervisor in their development as well. So it would definitely be about meeting with them separately and looking at, look, you know, I would usually go, look, this is how I tend to work, you know, depending upon the student. You know, this is what we look at in terms of how we work on this together. How does that sound to you? What are the things that you would like to focus on or learn, you know, more about through this experience? So, you know, in those kind of scenarios, that understanding of, you know, again, you're playing kind of some dual roles sometimes as a more experienced supervisor, but that ability to have that discussion. But also too, what I really appreciate that about working with supervisors that might not have as much experience is also to their different perspective and coming through probably research processes, you know, a lot more recently than I would have, you know, reflecting back on my, you know, doctorate, you know, nearly 20 years ago, is, you know, their ability to kind of look at things from a newer or different perspective, or because they're not as, because they're bringing a pair of fresh eyes to a supervisory process, that they might have ideas of ways in which to operate that they've seen and that they've, you know, experienced that would be really, really helpful to adopt. And so, like with anything, supervision is a practice, and this is part of it, is how we're making sure we're updating our practice and our knowledge about the process of supervision and how we support people in that, both from a people perspective, but also then, you know, like with anything, it's all what are we understanding the policy side, and are we understanding the key components of the administration of HDR students that is important as well. But with that, which I think I said in one of my posts, was also, you know, I've had different students that have almost relied upon the supervisors to tell them what to do next in terms of administration processes. I tend to bat that back because I'm like, well, you're a HDR student, there's lots of HDR information, you've got a responsibility to know what you need to be doing, just like we as supervisors have a responsibility to know that, or point them in the right direction. So it's not about not, assisting them, but that ability to not just be sometimes for more needy students, that go-to person that they just come to you first to ask a question that actually, well, that might be worth having a chat to the HDR student team.
Oh, Jean, you will appreciate this term then. So we constantly say you have to be that active feedback agent. You have to seek out the answers as well. So we really put a lot of onus onto the students too in the grad team.
Yeah.
Wow, that was excellent. Thank you. Priscilla's put a comment in the chat here. So Priscilla is working with the grad team at the moment. She's just recently finished her own PhD, and she's been working as a research assistant, working actually on the reaccreditation that we've got in place. Hi there, Priscilla. Just put a camera on. I think this is a really interesting comment and question here from Priscilla. Would you like to put it in your own words, Priscilla?
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you, Tasha. Can you hear me? Okay. So when I was a student, I was very unsure from the beginning because as an international student, I had another level of questions. How do they do that here in Australia or here at KUT? So very basic things like when I'm sending a piece of writing to my principal supervisor, should I put my associate supervisor as one of the main recipients? Should I just CC the associate supervisor, or should I just wait for the principal supervisor to ask for the associate supervisor to jump in the feedback? So very basic things, and those things add lots of pressure and anxiety on the students. So if we can have that clarified from the very beginning, it will just make things, I don't know, smoother maybe. So yeah. Thank you.
And Priscilla, I think a really great point, because sometimes it is just those small things. So for me, it is about that clarification, as in I kind of go like from a student perspective, I see that they would be emailing the supervisory team in the to box. If I'm a supervisor dealing with the student, I put the associate supervisors in the copy box because they're responding back. I'm copying them into that so that they're aware of that kind of thing. But again, that's for me is part of, that clarification up front, just some of the logistical aspects. And like, as somebody also mentioned in one of the posts, how do you manage feedback on documents, which is are you clarifying, okay, there's going to be a particular, this might be, one of the supervisors looks at it first, it then comes to me, so I'm adding to the same document, or that it's done online, that everyone's working on the same document, so that you're not getting multiple drafts of different versions with feedback that then the students trying to, or even supervisors are trying to work across double documents to try and, add feedback into. So it's just some of those things about efficiencies of the how of working that I think are really, really important. And I agree, sometimes overlooked, or just assumptions are made about that. But again, for me, that's also asking that preference of the supervisory team, knowing that, for example, in that one where I talked about an external supervisor, they didn't want to be understandably copied in all the back and forth, the usual kind of goings on of supervision outside of being brought in when they needed to be, to add in what that they can actually contribute. So it's just that ability to ask the questions and have the discussions right up front, and then you kind of set that process. And again, too, sometimes that will shift depending upon if one of the supervisors takes the lead more. So I know, in some recent PhDs that it's work between kind of some clinical trials from a kind of psychology and trauma perspective alongside kind of a dance area. So I know that in certain sections with combat veterans, so in certain sections, it's going to be very specific to, well, I want the associate supervisor who's the expert in the clinical trials perspective to really lead the feedback on that section, which he prefers to do in person with the student, versus I do a lot of the feedback in terms of with the document feedback online and then meet with the student to kind of discuss that. So we just know how we like to work on what sections, but we're always making sure that we're connected into that and always invited to the other person's supervision with the student. Sometimes we can make it, sometimes we don't, but we're always keeping those communication channels and each other on board, and sometimes having the off the record conversations when we think, okay, the student needs a bit of a kick up the bum to kind of get going. So how are we reinforcing certain things in a particular way to make sure that they're, you know, meeting those requirements and they're getting the same messages from both of the supervisors as well. So I think your point's a really important one. And again, too, particularly when you're navigating as an international student and English as a second language, and then a different university, maybe from the ones that you've been at, there's a whole range of different ways of working. And it's just that ability to ask the questions and find that out. But I see that as part of that responsibility of setting up the supervisory team, is how do we best want to work here? And that's been slightly varied depending upon who I'm working with and the student as well. Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, excellent. So, I mean, the takeaway from your comments there, Jean, are the how do you go about it? And communication is key at the start and in an ongoing way. Priscilla, you'll be, I don't know if you'll be pleased to hear or not, but I had a similar issue. I decided to send my document to my co-supervisor because I thought she would be able to answer something, and she sent it back to the entire team, and I wasn't expecting that. And so I was a little bit embarrassed that I hadn't sent it to my principal as well. So there's definitely, you know, having that communication at the start. Thank you so much, Priscilla. So we still have quite a few people here. There's nothing in the actual chat, but I invite you to take this opportunity to ask Jean a question.
I have another question. Sorry, I feel like I'm hogging the questions.
No, you're welcome.
Please cut me off if somebody else has one. My question is about, I've sort of noticed, I did my PhD at QT a few years ago, and my supervisors were colleagues. My principal supervisor was a close colleague. He's in the same team as I am. We actually had a really good process in place because I was the study area coordinator, which means that I wasn't his supervisor in any capacity, but I was looking over the work that he was doing as a lecturer. But he was my supervisor, so it was a sort of a slightly odd dynamic, but we worked it out really well in that we sort of established early on that whenever we would have meetings, that was when he was in supervisor mode, and when the meeting finished, we'd come out of that mode and we'd be collegial and we'd go to the pub, we'd have lunch, we'd socialize as, you know, I would with any other close colleague. But it did strike me a few times as we're going through the process, because my PhD, like any, you know, part-time PhD student, was long and drawn out, and I had lots of deadlines that I struggled with, but I got through it in time. But I guess the point was, I felt very fortunate to have such a good professional and personal relationship with my supervisor. But I'm conscious that because we have so many staff who come, like myself, to arrive at the university without a doctorate and then go through that process, it must be a very different dynamic for supervisors who are, I haven't supervised a colleague yet, and maybe that's in my future, but it must be, for those of you who have supervised colleagues, it must be a different dynamic again.
Yeah, look, Joe, I think that's a great scenario, because what comes to mind for me is that I have supervised people when I've been a head of school that technically I'm formally their supervisor of. Now, it might not be their direct supervisor in terms of PPR, but it's certainly been that they're in teams that, you know, feed up. And I think that aspect of, again, it's recognizing not just the supervisory student perspective, you know, power differential, but it's that understanding that in this context, I'm just your supervisor. This is to do with your research and your research project. This is not to do with, you know, work, and that ability. Again, too, for me, that's part of building that relationship and building that trust in that way. And I think, well, they obviously felt comfortable in the first place because they asked me anyway, and that was kind of an area that I could assist with. But I think it's also being conscious of that, and certainly, like you said, that ability to go even with a colleague where, you know, it's like in this context, this is the working relationship that we have for these reasons, and these are the roles that we play. And when we step outside of that, that's where we operate, you know, normally in that sense. So I think that's a really, really helpful observation. And I think, again, too, I kind of feel like, well, that's that onus on the supervisor or supervisors, if they're in that situation, to ensure that those kind of things are discussed and not feel like, because that's when the power differential can come in, that's then, you know, the student might not feel comfortable. And even though they might be comfortable enough to be supervised, that ability to, oh, well, if I, you know, challenge or have a different perspective as Jean in my supervision, is that potentially going to play out in my staffing role outside of that? And so it's that ability to really, you know, flag, look, these are all the dual kind of relationships that you might have within these kind of scenarios, even whether it's a supervisor in a work sense or a colleague. And just that we're talking about it, like you said, that Jo, that you guys did up front, and that we're establishing how we work together and what that means to be able to step out of that. So I think that's a really, really fantastic point that you've made, Jo. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Jo.
Yeah.
Hi there. Would you like to contribute something?
I have a question, and hi everyone, and thank James for very good advice and reflection that you've just done. There, I have not supervised any HDR student. I did supervise some master student for their research projects, and I'm very new. Could you or any of you actually be able to sort of share one thing that you wished you have learned before you start doing it, and I shouldn't do the same thing if I start having my HDR student, which I will have very soon? I'm quite nervous, so if that be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'd love to hear from other people too, because I think this is what, for me, this is what the great thing is that lots of people have experiences, and the more that we share those and we can learn from those, the better that we can become as supervisors. I think for me, my learning was more about, for the most part, you know, the students that I've supervised have been great, and just, you know, again, have been, not all of them have finished. Many of them have had personal issues or taken leave or time off in between. There've been a variety of scenarios, but there's probably only been one situation where it was a difficult student to manage in the process, and they were put on review a number of times. And probably the learning from that, you know, it's that balance out between, for me, that how are you being supportive and enabling them to be autonomous, but balancing out that need for, at the end of the day, there are clear things and clear responsibilities and commitments that they need to meet. And how you go about managing those. So sometimes I think my learning was, in some instances, probably in that particular case earlier on, I probably didn't challenge certain things as much about with the student and kind of what they were saying about what they were doing as much. I probably trusted a little bit more in believing that to be true, which it actually ended up not being. So you like to think that that's what you, that's the position that you start from. So it was probably being a little bit, more, direct or directive earlier than I probably was in that instance. And that's a really, like I said, it's been one student in, you know, nearly 20. So it's very, you know, it's unusual, but it can happen. And I think then it was just more about when you start to see repetitive behavior in that instance, if, you know, again, too, you're trying to be supportive, but knowing that they're actually, you know, again, they've committed to certain things, and if they're not going to meet that. But for me, it was also too about it's how you go about it, that there's always a mutual respect in terms of dealing with difficult situations. But that was probably my learning, was probably about maybe not being as direct sooner than now. Whether or not that would have helped, it might not have, but that was probably my learning in that instance, in that kind of unique situation. But I'd love to hear from other people as well.
Thank you. That's really, really insightful, actually. And I've seen some of the students, the HDR student from, my the colleague to supervise those students, and that is one of the reasons that make their PhD prolonged than they're supposed to be. And of course, we know that life, a lot of things happening that we can't predict, and so they prolong it too long. And not one or two, but a number of students. And I just find, oh my God, how do I, do all of that, and as supporting student in a way, but also meeting the deadline, if you like, of their PhD or candidates, that sort of thing. Thank you.
So many layers to being a supervisor, isn't there, Jean? When you think about.
Yeah, there is. And I think this is the thing too. We're dealing with people that have lives and challenges and pressures outside of that. And so that's the other thing too. Probably my learning from that first experience also was that, where there are students are facing significant challenges, take that leave of absence. Like, it's okay. We're managing this in that way. We're managing that in terms of ensuring that we know when those kind of key things are and what that expanse is in terms of candidature. So we're not, but that ability that life does happen and people really need to look after themselves, and that's the most important thing at the end of the day, because guess what, even if you didn't finish your PhD, you could, if you really wanted to, come back and do it. It's not going away, whereas things that happen in life and health and death and a whole range of other things, in terms of family or loved ones, that's really critical in ensuring that the students and the people get the support that they need during that time. They don't need extra pressure. So I guess the scenario that I used was very much it wasn't so much it wasn't so much a lack of support for certain circumstances, but it was just that ability to actually stick on to make sure that they kind of kept on, and if that wasn't going to be viable for them, that's okay, but they wanted to. So
in my role in the grad team, I deliver workshops for students, but I also deliver workshops for supervisors. And one of the, in particular workshops, I talk about being human and the fact that your supervisors are human, your students are human, and particularly with what we've all just been through with COVID, I think that's really something that's on everybody's mind as well, and the student benefit. So please reach out to me. My email is in the chat. I'm just conscious of time. Is there anybody else who'd like to ask a question or have any comments, feedback about this week's module? Hi, Jessica.
Hi. Yeah, hi, Natasha and Jean. Thank you for this session. I have a question regarding the industry itself, like how to help students to gain more industry skills, like because based on my experience in the PhD, I was focused on the research itself, but when I tried to look, like for example, for a job, it wasn't that easy. Yeah, so any advice on how to help them? Yep,
absolutely. And look, I think Jessica, Tash will probably have some really great suggestions in terms of all of the actual support, training, skills development, opportunities for internships and things that can happen during PhDs that are directly focused on helping to support, research students actually develop those connections as well as skills that are going to benefit for their careers. So I might hand over to Tash in terms of a bit of an update in terms of what grad can actually offer.
I'm busy trying to find the right screen to show you, and I haven't found it. Oh, here we go. So you'll be pleased to know, Jessica, I'm just getting that screen up. In the grad team, we have dedicated industry engagement officers, and they, in fact, and everybody here should know that your students get weekly updates on industry internships. Every Tuesday, I think it goes out, and there's a list of internships. But we, again, if you get in touch with me at that email, Jessica, I can introduce you to our industry engagement officers, but they're a dedicated team to provide support, industry support. And as you can see from the module this week, it's very important, and QUT is also benefiting from that. It's just, you know, supervision is just evolving, and supervisors are, the whole concept of supervision has evolved so much. In industry, internships are such a focus now, and I think in the past the supervisors were just, you know, train the student, get that train them to be an expert and help them with their original contribution, but there's so much more involved now, and supervisors really need to understand what's available to students, and how, you know, also have that question, what is your students aim? Do they hope to enter industry? Do they hope to enter into academia? There's so many elements to it, but we do have dedicated officers, and my screen is stuck in it and I cannot show you, but if you go to the landing page as well for research students, there's a whole tile section on industry. But yes, we have it all covered in the GRED team, Jessica, so please get in touch.
Okay, thank you for the information, because I seen the change, because previously they were not like for example the possibility of the internships, but now I seen that progressively QUT is involving more like these opportunities. And
you know, I recently went to the Hertz conference in Brisbane last week, and I got to meet colleagues from all over the world, and we really have a great setup in the GRED team. There's so much support. We have a career educator as well who can also talk to your students. They offer one-to-one sessions. They also have workshops, and there, I think Priscilla and Sentha, who are here today, they're with the GRED team. I think we also we have supervisor workshops for on industry as well, don't we? I can't actually think of what that title is, but part of the reaccreditation at QUT is for all supervisors to do something every 2 years, and doing a workshop on industry is also possible for the supervisors to gain that current knowledge on what's happening and how QUT is helping advance students to enter industry. Oh, Sentha, thank you so much. She's actually put it in the chat, and it's called Engage with Industry. Jean, there's a question here from Marissa. I'll read it out for the sake of the recording. So, hi everyone, I'm a supervisor for a student under an NHMRC with key objectives. I'm wondering what are some strategies to navigate autonomy of the student and the key objectives of the grant?
Yeah.
Jean?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing that comes to mind, so we know certainly in terms of, you know, something like that, it's very explicit in terms of key objectives and deadlines and delivery requirements. I think in working on kind of similar scenarios, not at that level, but certainly in terms of other kind of funded projects with students, sometimes that ability in terms of autonomy is around, you know, what's their role potentially in development or leading components of meeting those objectives. So it could be around again, too, you know, planning out depending upon their experience and what they're comfortable with, but that discussion around, are there other things that when we're thinking about what needs to be delivered, the way in which it's delivered, are there components where we can offer them a little bit of an opportunity to explore something within the boundaries of that a little bit further, or lead a component in terms of being somebody that thinks about, with support or asking questions, you know, how to initiate certain aspects of the research, that's going on in terms of meeting those objectives. So I see it kind of, sometimes conceptually it might be a broadening of, well, we know we're looking at this area. There are other things that they think might be interesting that they could bring back that kind of are complementary or additional that they found or explored without taking them, too much off track, versus what their role is within the grant. And are we supporting them to maybe step forward to kind of lead a certain component of that gives them that, sense of autonomy and also experience, supported experience in contributing in a way that normally they might feel like, well, I'm just here to do these things, as opposed to, well, I'm here to get some experience with support and some coaching and enabling to be able to lead or talk about or, run a session in terms of a meeting that's talking about the approach or, think about different ideas. So, again, I think it comes down to, if we're supervising, what are the needs or the identified goals that the student might have in terms of being involved in that. We know that we might recruit people or have people there to help with certain components, but within that envelope, how do we support them potentially to be more autonomous in how they go about that research? So that's very briefly, Marissa, kind of a couple of things that come to mind in thinking about where things are so structured or very specific, how could we support that kind of development? So I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question, Marissa.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm just outside taking this beautiful sun, but that's really
beautiful.
great, because I'm really conscious of that autonomy and the respect for that autonomy. And I often say to my wonderful student, you're pretty amazing and you're going to be the expert in this area. So I'm always trying to enable it, but there are some key objectives that we it's a tricky, but those points that you raised are really helpful. Thanks very much.
No worries. It's just that we know that there are those things, but within that kind of space, how could we be enabling or supporting them to take a slightly different role in terms of leading certain things, so they kind of feel like there's that sense of autonomy, despite the kind of sometimes the very clear structure and limitations around the objectives and the delivery aspects.
Thanks.
No worries.
That's great, Marissa, thank you. And you can see on the screen now, thanks to Priscilla and Santha, this is the supervisor workshop supporting HDRs in their internships. So there's links in the chat for you, and Priscilla's also put a link for all workshops, research accreditation, and there's also this site that Santha, I think, put on for us, and this is for your students about industry engagement and all of the relevant people that you can contact. And honestly, it's such a a great team with some great initiatives for students. Right, so I've just lost my chat. Okay, so we're almost done. I'm conscious there are a couple of people who haven't said anything or commented, so last chance, very quickly. You can put it in the chat if you like, or.
But if there is anything further to, I'm more than happy, on this particular kind of topic, if you want to just drop me a line, drop me an email. If you had further questions or, want to ask a question, but you didn't feel as comfortable or want to find out more information, that kind of thing, please do reach out.
That's very kind of you, Jean. Thank you. And again, from the GRED team and from myself, I'd like to thank you for your accessibility and for your expertise in answering all of these discussion points. Will has added that there's nothing to add. Found the discussion and the course material is very helpful. So you're very welcome, Will. Thank you for that. And thumbs up from Jean. Okay, well, thanks guys for being here. We know that it's a busy, supervisors are busy, and that's another thing I say to my students, your supervisors are busy, and when they're feeling a little neglected, and so, but as Jean said at the start as well, part of this wonderful experience of supervision, it is important to stay abreast of things, new process, new changes, and having the opportunity like these to connect and meet and discuss with each other. I think it's valuable, and it's great that you were able to be here today. So thank you everybody again. We look forward to seeing you next week for week 3, which is starting out with your students, is the topic for week 3. So I'll be sending out, we'll be doing another Zoom next week with Eric, excuse me, I can't remember, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Excuse me, Eric, I'm embarrassed there. And yeah, so I look forward to seeing you all again in week 3 and reading all your wonderful discussions. So thanks again, Jean. Thank you to everyone for being here, and have a great weekend.
Cool. Thanks all. Take care.
Thanks everybody. Thanks, Jean. Thanks,
No
Natasha.
worries. Thanks, Jane. Bye.